The knife was already at her throat when the doors of the great hall crashed open. Elena Voss did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only made men press the blade harder, so she stood very still in the servants' corridor, her back against cold stone, while a drunken guard named Rolf leaned in close and told her exactly what he planned to do once his shift ended. She could smell the wine on his breath. She could feel her own heartbeat slamming against her ribs. And then the corridor went dark, as if something enormous had blocked out the torchlight, and Rolf's whole body left the ground. He did not fall. He was thrown, the way a person might throw aside a piece of trash that had touched something precious. He hit the far wall hard enough to crack the plaster, and he did not get up again for a long moment. Elena turned, breath caught in her chest, and found herself looking up into the face of the Alpha King. She had seen him before, always from a distance, always across a crowded hall where she was carrying trays or folding linens, never once close enough to notice the color of his eyes. Now she noticed. They were a pale, burning gold, the kind of gold that did not belong to an ordinary man, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made the air feel too thin to breathe. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was a current underneath it, like a river running fast beneath a frozen surface. "No," she managed. "No, my lord. Look at me." She had already been looking at him, but something in the command made her lift her chin higher, made her meet his eyes fully, instead of glancing away the way servants were taught to do. The moment their eyes locked, King Cade Ashgrove went completely still, the way a predator goes still, right before it understands that everything has changed. "Are you mated?" The question came out of nowhere, sharp and strange, and for a moment, Elena thought she had misheard him. "My lord?" Answer the question. He had not blinked once since she turned around. Not once. His jaw was tight, his shoulders squared, every line of his body coiled like a bowstring pulled to its limit. "Are you mated to anyone?" "Bonded, marked. Answer me." Elena's mind raced. In Blackthorn Ridge, every wolf carried a mark somewhere on their skin, a pale crescent that bloomed into gold the instant they met their true mate. She had none. She had never had one. It was the reason her own pack back home had treated her like a piece of furniture nobody wanted to claim, the reason her mother had stopped meeting her eyes years ago, the reason she had been shipped off to serve in the capital, instead of being allowed to stay and marry within her own village, like every other girl her age. "No," she said quietly. "I have no mark. I have no mate. I never will." Something flickered across the king's face, gone as quickly as it appeared. Relief, maybe, or recognition, or something far more dangerous than either. "Good," he said. Then, without another word of explanation, he turned to the two guards who had appeared behind him and said only, "She does not leave the palace grounds, not for any reason. Post someone outside her door tonight." "Wait," Elena said, finding her voice at last. "My lord, wait. I have done nothing wrong. I only wanted to reach the kitchens before curfew. I was not trying to—" "This has nothing to do with wrongdoing." He finally looked away from her, glancing instead at Rolf's crumpled body against the wall, and something cold passed over his expression, the look of a man deciding whether someone deserved to live. "He will be dealt with. You will be protected. That is all you need to understand tonight." Protected from what? He looked back at her, and for one heartbeat, just one, the mask of the king slipped, and she saw something almost human underneath it. Confusion, hunger, fear even, though kings were not supposed to be afraid of anything. "From everyone," he said, "including me, perhaps." And then he was gone, his dark cloak sweeping around the corner, leaving Elena alone in the corridor, with a groaning guard, and a question she could not begin to answer. She did not sleep that night. How could she? With a royal guard posted directly outside her small servant's room, his boots audible every time he shifted his weight against the doorframe. She lay on her narrow cot and stared at the cracked ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. "Are you mated?" He had asked it like the answer would determine the fate of the entire kingdom. He had asked it without blinking, as if blinking might make him miss something important about her face, her scent, her presence. And when she had said no, something in him had settled, like a held breath finally released. It made no sense. Elena was nobody. She was a blank, an unmarked girl from a minor pack in the Eastern Hills, sent to the capital 3 years ago because her own family could not stand the shame of having a daughter who would never bond, never marry, never be chosen. She scrubbed floors. She carried water. She was, by every measure that mattered in Blackthorn Ridge, invisible. And yet the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories had looked at her as though she were the only person in the entire hall. By morning, the whispers had already started. She heard them in the kitchens before she had even finished tying her apron. The king had broken a guard's arm and 2 ribs over a servant girl. The king had ordered a full watch placed on a blank-marked nobody. The king, who had rejected every noble daughter and every foreign princess presented to him at court, who had turned away 3 separate delegations hoping to arrange a royal match, had suddenly taken an interest in a girl who scrubbed his floors. "You," said Mabel, the head cook, jabbing a wooden spoon in Elena's direction the moment she walked in. "What did you do to catch his eye?" "Nothing," Elena said honestly. "I don't know why he—" "Careful," Mabel cut in, lowering her voice, glancing toward the doorway as though the walls themselves might be listening. "A king's attention is not a gift, girl. It's a leash. Whatever he wants from you, he'll get it, one way or another. Best you figure out what that is before it figures out you." Elena did not have an answer for that either. She spent the day in a fog, carrying trays, sweeping halls, waiting for the summons she was certain would come. It came just after the evening meal, delivered by a stern-faced woman named Greta, who introduced herself as the keeper of the royal household. "The king wishes to see you," Greta said. "Now, come." Elena's hands trembled as she untied her apron and smoothed down her simple dress, painfully aware of how plain she looked, how unworthy of a royal summons. Greta led her through corridors Elena had never been permitted to walk before, past tapestries depicting the founding of Blackthorn Ridge, past guards who did not so much as glance at her, until they reached a set of tall wooden doors carved with the shape of a running wolf. "In there," Greta said. "He is waiting." The room beyond was a private study, not the throne room Elena had expected, lined with books and lit by a low fire. King Cade stood near the window with his back to her, hands clasped behind him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You wanted to see me, my lord," Elena finally said, when the silence became unbearable. He turned. In the firelight, his eyes looked less like burning gold and more like something older, something tired. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "Please." She sat, mostly because her legs did not seem willing to argue with a king. He remained standing, pacing slightly, as though he were choosing his words with unusual care. "What is your name?" "Elena. Elena Voss." "Where are you from?" "Elena Voss." "The Eastern Hills, Thornfield Pack. My lord, if I have done something to offend you, I would rather know plainly than sit here guessing." A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "You have not offended me. If anything, the opposite is true." He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. "Tell me about your family, your mother, your grandmother. Do you know much of your bloodline?" The question caught her off guard. "Not much. My grandmother died before I was born. My mother rarely spoke of her. There were always rumors in the village, things whispered but never explained. Some people said our family carried a curse." Something sharpened in his expression. "What kind of curse?" "I don't know exactly. Only that no woman in our line has ever borne a mate mark. Not my grandmother, not my mother, not me. We are what the old women call blanks. It is why I was sent away. A blank cannot be matched to anyone, cannot bond, cannot marry within the pack structure. I was considered a waste of a household's resources." She said it plainly, without self-pity, because she had made peace with the fact years ago, even if the memory still stung. "Is that why you asked if I was mated? Because everyone can see I have no mark?" Cade was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, almost gentle. "Elena, when I asked if you were mated, I was not asking about a mark on your skin. I was asking because the moment our eyes met in that corridor, I felt something I have never felt before in my entire life. A pull, a recognition, as though some part of me already knew you, though we had never spoken a single word to each other." Elena's breath caught. That's not possible. I have no mark. I can't be anyone's mate. There has never been a case of an unmarked wolf. I know what the old laws say, Cade interrupted, and there was an edge of frustration in his voice now, though it did not seem directed at her. I have read every text in this palace's library twice over since last night, trying to find an explanation. There are no recorded cases, no precedent, nothing to tell me what I felt was real, or what it means if it is. Then maybe it isn't real, Elena said, though her voice shook slightly as she said it. Maybe you are simply mistaken, my lord. Kings are not immune to mistakes. Perhaps. He came closer, slowly, the way a person approaches a wild animal they do not wish to frighten away. But I have never once, in 30 years of life, felt my chest tighten the way it did when you looked up at me last night. I have never felt the urge to put my body between danger and a stranger, the way I did the moment I saw that guard's hand near your throat. Call it whatever you like. I call it something I cannot ignore. Elena stood abruptly, putting distance between them, her heart hammering. My lord, I am a servant. I clean floors and carry water. I am not a noble daughter or a foreign princess. Whatever this feeling is, it cannot be what you think it is. I would ask that you let me return to my duties and forget that any of this happened. I cannot do that. Why not? Because if I am right, he said, and his golden eyes held hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away, then you are the only person in this entire kingdom I am meant to protect above all others. And I do not intend to lose you to a mistake, a misunderstanding, or a guard with wandering hands, simply because I was too cautious to say the truth out loud. Elena's throat felt tight. Everything about this conversation defied everything she had ever been taught about her place in the world. She was nobody. She was unmarked, unwanted, sent away by her own family, and yet the most powerful man in the kingdom stood before her, speaking as though she were the center of some enormous, unfinished story. I don't know what you want from me, she whispered. Time, Cade said simply. That is all I am asking for right now. Time to understand what this is, and time to keep you safe while I search for answers. You will remain in the palace. You will have proper quarters, proper protection, and you will not be required to serve as you did before. And if I refuse? If I want to leave? To go back to my old life? For the first time, something like real pain crossed his face. Then, I would have to let you go, he said quietly, because I am not a man who takes what is not freely given, no matter what my instincts scream at me to do. But I am asking you, Elena Voss, not commanding you. Stay. Let me find out what this is. If it is nothing, I will let you return to your life exactly as it was, no questions asked. Elena looked at him for a long moment, at the strange mixture of power and uncertainty in his face, and thought about the guard's hand at her throat, about years of being treated as unwanted, about the strange warmth that had spread through her own chest the instant their eyes had first met, though she had told herself since that it was only fear, only shock. I will stay, she said finally, for now, until we know the truth. Something in his shoulders eased, as though he had been bracing for a different answer. Thank you, he said. You will not regret it. But even as she left the study that night, walking back through unfamiliar corridors toward a set of new quarters she had never expected to have, Elena could not shake the feeling that regret was exactly what waited for her at the end of whatever this was. Because kings did not simply take an interest in unmarked servant girls without consequence. Somewhere in this palace, people were already talking, already scheming, already deciding what her sudden and unexplained importance might mean for their own ambitions. And somewhere beyond the palace walls, in villages and packs across the kingdom, old curses that had slept for generations were beginning, very quietly, to stir. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Elena did not cry herself to sleep from loneliness. Instead, she lay awake in unfamiliar sheets, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, and wondered whether the strange golden-eyed king who refused to blink when he looked at her was about to save her life, ruin it completely, or somehow, impossibly, do both at once. The new quarters were larger than anything Elena had ever slept in, with a real bed instead of a cot, a wash basin of polished silver, and a window that looked out over the palace gardens instead of a servant's courtyard. She should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt like an animal placed in a comfortable cage, one whose bars were simply better disguised than the ones she had grown used to. Word of her new status spread through the palace faster than she could have imagined. By the second morning, the other servants had stopped speaking to her entirely, their eyes sliding away whenever she passed, their whispers falling silent the moment she entered a room. Mabel was the only one who still met her gaze directly, though even she seemed torn between pity and suspicion. "They're saying you bewitched him," Mabel told her quietly, setting a plate of bread and fruit in front of Elena, in the small private dining room she had been assigned. "Some old blank-marked magic from the Eastern Hills. Others say you're a spy sent to weaken him from the inside. Nobody believes it's as simple as him actually caring for you." "It isn't simple," Elena admitted. "I don't understand it myself." "Then you'd best figure it out quickly," Mabel warned, "because the nobles in this palace do not take kindly to a servant girl rising above her station. Whatever the reason, there are families who have spent years trying to arrange a match with the king. They will not sit quietly while an unmarked orphan from nowhere steals their chance." Elena thought of that warning often over the following days, as she was fitted for new clothes she had not asked for, assigned a personal guard she had not requested, and found herself the subject of stares every time she walked through the palace halls. She saw Cade only briefly during that time, always surrounded by advisors, always occupied with matters of the kingdom, though he made a point of finding her each evening, if only for a few quiet minutes. "Any progress?" she asked him on the fourth evening, as they sat together in the same study where he had first explained himself, a fire crackling low in the hearth. "Some," he said, though his expression was troubled. "I have sent word to the Eastern Hills, requesting any surviving records from Thornfield Pack regarding your family line. I have also been reading through the older histories of Blackthorn Ridge, from before my grandfather's time. There are fragments, references to bloodlines that were deliberately hidden or suppressed generations ago, though the records are incomplete and scattered. Hidden from whom, and why? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." He looked at her then, and something softer crossed his features. "How are you settling in, truthfully?" Elena considered lying, offering the polite answer a servant might give a king. But something about the honesty in his question made her want to match it. "Truthfully, I feel like an intruder wearing someone else's life. The other servants avoid me. The nobles stare at me like I've stolen something from them. I don't belong in silk dresses and private dining rooms, my lord. I belong scrubbing floors, and at least there I understood my place." "You do not have to belong to a place to deserve safety within it," he said quietly. "And please, when we are alone like this, you do not have to call me my lord. Cade will do." "Cade," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. It felt strange, too intimate, too familiar for the distance she still felt between them, despite everything. "I still don't understand why you're doing all of this. Surely there are simpler ways to investigate a strange feeling than uprooting a servant's entire life." "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I have learned, in 30 years of ruling this kingdom, that instincts should not be ignored simply because they are inconvenient. And my instincts, Elena, have never screamed this loudly about anything before." She did not have an answer for that, and so she said nothing, letting the fire crackle in the silence between them, letting herself, just for a moment, imagine what it might mean if he was right. If somewhere beneath her unmarked skin, hidden by whatever old curse had haunted her bloodline, there existed a bond that connected her to this strange, intense, golden-eyed king who refused, even now, to look away from her for very long. She did not yet know that beyond the palace walls, a noblewoman named Seraphine Wren had already heard the rumors, and was, at that very moment, sitting in her family's estate with a letter in her hand, already planning exactly how she intended to remove the unmarked servant girl from the king's life for good. She did not yet know that somewhere in the archives beneath the palace, buried under decades of dust, sat a record that would explain everything about her bloodline, and that finding it would put both her life and the king's crown in more danger than either of them could imagine. And she did not yet know that the guard posted outside her door each night was not simply there for her protection, but because Cade Ashgrove, Alpha King of Blackthorn Ridge, could not bear the thought of anything happening to her while he slept. even if he had not yet found the courage to say so directly to her face. All Elena knew, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep that fourth night in the palace, was that her old life was gone completely, replaced by something she did not understand and could not yet trust. And somewhere deep inside her chest, buried beneath years of learned indifference and quiet loneliness, something small and unfamiliar had begun, very cautiously, to hope. 5 days after the incident in the corridor, Elena was summoned again, though this time not to the king's private study, but to a small chamber near the palace archives, where a thin, elderly man named Master Oswin greeted her with a stack of yellowed papers and an expression of barely contained curiosity. "The king asked me to speak with you," Oswin said, adjusting a pair of round spectacles that made his eyes look enormous. "I am the keeper of records here. He believes you might be able to help me identify some names in these old family registers." Elena sat across from him at a worn wooden table, the smell of old paper and dust thick in the air. "I don't know how much help I can be. I know almost nothing about my family history." "Nonsense," Oswin said briskly, sliding a brittle page toward her. "Everyone knows more than they think they do. Tell me, does the name Rosalind Voss mean anything to you?" Elena's breath caught. "That was my grandmother's name. How do you know it?" Oswin's magnified eyes lit up with excitement. "Because, my dear girl, your grandmother's name appears in a royal registry from nearly 40 years ago, a registry of court attendants, specifically those who served during the reign of King Aldrich, the current king's grandfather." He tapped the page with a bony finger. "Your grandmother worked in this very palace before you were ever born." Elena stared at the faded ink, at her grandmother's name written in careful, old-fashioned script. "I never knew that. My mother never spoke of her working here. She barely spoke of her at all." "That is curious in itself, isn't it? Families do not typically hide something so ordinary as palace service, unless there was a reason to hide it." Oswin leaned back, folding his hands. "I have been searching the deeper archives since the king requested it, and I found something else. A partial record, damaged by fire many years ago, referencing a curse placed upon a serving woman's bloodline. The details are frustratingly incomplete, but the timing lines up almost exactly with your grandmother's years of service here." "What kind of curse?" "That is precisely what I do not yet know," Oswin admitted. "The relevant pages were destroyed. Whether by accident or by design I cannot say, but I intend to keep searching, and I would ask that you do the same in your own way. Speak to anyone from your home village who might remember your grandmother. Any detail, however small, could matter." Elena left the archive chamber with her mind spinning, the fragments of a story she had never known circling through her thoughts. Her grandmother had served in this very palace. Something had happened here, something significant enough to be recorded, then deliberately erased. And somehow, decades later, she had been sent right back to the same walls her grandmother had once walked, drawn there not by choice but by circumstance, only to catch the eye of a king who felt an inexplicable pull toward her. It did not feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like the slow unraveling of something that had been carefully, deliberately hidden for a very long time. That evening, when she told Cade what Oswin had discovered, his expression darkened with an intensity that made the fire in the study seem to burn colder. "Your grandmother served under my grandfather," he said slowly, working through the implications aloud. "And something happened to her here, something significant enough to warrant a curse and a cover-up. Elena, I need you to understand something. Curses of that magnitude, ones capable of suppressing a mate mark across multiple generations, are not simple spells. They require enormous power, the kind of power that, in the old days, only royal bloodlines or ancient packs of significant standing could summon. Are you saying someone in your own family might have cursed mine? I am saying I do not know, and that frightens me more than almost anything else in this situation." He rubbed a hand across his jaw, weariness evident beneath the composed exterior he wore for the rest of the court. "If the curse originated here, in this palace, then whoever cast it had a reason, and reasons for curses of that magnitude are rarely kind ones." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. "Then maybe this is a warning. Maybe whatever happened to my grandmother is meant to happen to me too. Maybe I should leave the palace after all, before anything else gets uncovered." "No. The word came out sharper than he seemed to intend, and he visibly softened his tone afterward. Forgive me. What I mean is, running will not undo whatever was already set into motion the moment our paths crossed. If there is a danger here, Elena, it exists whether you stay within these walls or return to the eastern hills. At least here, I can keep you close. I can keep you protected while we search for the truth. Elena studied him for a long moment, this strange king who spoke of protection with such fierce conviction, who had upended his own court and invited scandal simply to keep a servant girl safe from a danger neither of them fully understood yet. All right, she said finally. I'll stay. But I want to be part of the search, Cade. This is my family, my history. I refuse to sit quietly in a comfortable room while other people decide my fate for me. Not again. Not after everything I've already lost by being sent away. Something like respect flickered across his face. Agreed. Tomorrow, you will join Oswin in the archives directly. Between the three of us, we will find the truth, whatever it costs. Outside the study window, the moon had risen high and pale over the palace gardens, and somewhere beyond the walls, in a grand estate on the far side of the capital, Seraphine Wren sat awake long past midnight, reading and rereading a letter from a source deep inside the palace, a letter that confirmed everything she had feared, and everything she intended to use. The unmarked servant girl was no longer simply an inconvenience to be dismissed. She was a threat, one tied to old secrets and older curses, and Seraphine had no intention of allowing a nobody from the eastern hills to steal the crown she had spent her entire life preparing to wear. The game, though Elena did not yet know it, had already begun, and not everyone playing it intended to be gentle about how it ended. The scream tore through the eastern wing of the palace just before dawn, and Elena was on her feet before she fully understood why, her heart pounding, her body moving on instinct toward the sound before her mind had caught up with the danger. She reached the corridor to find two guards restraining a servant boy who thrashed and shouted, his eyes wide with something between terror and rage, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. It took 4 grown men to hold him still, and even then, he nearly broke free twice, his strength far beyond what his slight frame should have allowed. What's happening to him? Elena asked, backing against the wall as the commotion spilled past her. Get her out of here, someone barked, and strong hands closed around her arm, pulling her away from the chaos. She turned to find Cade beside her, his expression grim, already steering her back down the corridor toward safer ground. What was that? She demanded, once they had put distance between themselves and the shouting. A wolfsbane reaction, Cade said tightly. Someone poisoned his evening meal. He will likely survive, but only because it was caught early. He stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his golden eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Elena, that boy was assigned to deliver meals to the eastern wing. Your wing. The implication settled over her like ice water. You think it was meant for me. I think it is too great a coincidence to ignore, he said. Someone within this palace already knows enough about your significance to want you removed, and they were willing to poison an innocent servant boy to make an attempt on your life look accidental. Elena's hands were shaking, though she pressed them flat against her skirts to hide it. Who would do such a thing? I have been here less than 2 weeks. I know almost no one. That is precisely what worries me, Cade said. Whoever did this does not need to know you personally. They only need to see you as an obstacle. He glanced back toward the commotion still unfolding down the corridor, then made a decision she could see settle into his shoulders like armor. From this moment forward, you will not eat anything that has not been personally tasted and approved. You will not walk the palace grounds without an escort, and you will move to quarters adjoining my own private wing, where the guard is doubled and no unfamiliar servant has access. Cade, that will only fuel more rumors. People already whisper that I've bewitched you. If I move into rooms beside yours, they will assume the worst. Let them assume whatever they like, he said flatly. I would rather endure 1,000 rumors than attend your funeral, because I was too concerned with appearances to keep you properly safe. There was no arguing with the finality in his voice, and truthfully, standing in that corridor with the memory of the boy's screams still echoing in her ears, Elena did not have the strength to try. The new quarters were, if anything, more luxurious than her previous rooms, adjoining a private hallway that led directly to the king's own chambers, guarded day and night by two of his most trusted men. Elena should have felt safer. Instead, she felt trapped, the walls of her gilded cage drawing tighter with every passing day. It was Mabel, of all people, who finally voiced what Elena had been silently thinking for days. "You look like you're being hunted," the older woman observed, setting down a tray of food she had personally prepared and tasted before bringing it up herself, a small kindness Elena would not soon forget. "Not by wolves, by walls." "I feel like I'm suffocating," Elena admitted quietly, sitting on the edge of her enormous bed, staring at hands that trembled more often now than they used to. "Every door has a guard. Every meal is tested before I'm allowed to touch it. I haven't walked outside without an escort in over a week. This isn't protection, Mabel. It's a prison with better furniture." "Have you told him that?" "He wouldn't listen. Or he would listen, and then he would double the guards anyway, because he's convinced himself that keeping me sealed away is the only way to keep me alive." Elena looked up, frustration bleeding into her voice. "I understand he's frightened. I'm frightened too. But I can't live like this, Mabel. I would rather face whatever danger is out there than spend the rest of my life locked inside these walls." Mabel studied her for a long moment, then sighed and lowered her voice. "Then you'll have to decide what matters more to you, girl. Safety or freedom? Because in my experience, powerful men rarely let you have both at once, no matter how much they claim to care." That conversation stayed with Elena long after Mabel left, circling through her mind as she lay awake that night, staring at the same unfamiliar ceiling she had stared at for weeks now, feeling the walls press closer with every breath. By the time dawn broke, she had made a decision, reckless and probably foolish, but one she could not talk herself out of. She was going to leave, not forever, not to abandon the search for the truth about her family, but simply to breathe, to walk beyond the palace gates, without a guard trailing 3 steps behind her, if only for an hour. She needed to remember what it felt like to belong to herself again. She waited until the guards outside her door changed shifts, a window of perhaps 10 minutes during which the corridor stood briefly empty, a gap in the routine she had noticed over the past several days, without consciously planning to use it. She dressed in the plainest clothes she still owned, pulled a hood over her hair, and slipped out through a servant's passage she remembered from her early days working in the kitchens, one that led to a side gate rarely used by anyone but the delivery carts. The gate guard barely glanced at her, waving through what he assumed was simply another servant running an early errand, and then Elena was outside the palace walls for the first time in weeks, standing on a quiet street as the capital slowly woke around her, the morning air cool and sharp and entirely, wonderfully free. She walked without any real direction, simply grateful for the absence of eyes tracking her every movement, grateful for the ordinary sounds of a city waking up, merchants opening shutters, children laughing somewhere down a side alley, the distant call of birds overhead. For nearly an hour, she allowed herself to forget about curses and marks and kings who refused to blink, and simply existed as Elena Voss, an ordinary young woman enjoying an ordinary morning. It could not last, of course. She heard the commotion before she saw it, the sound of hooves and raised voices cutting through the peaceful morning, and turned to find a group of palace guards moving through the street with unmistakable urgency, searching, calling her name. She should have gone to them immediately. Instead, some old instinct, the same one that had kept her quiet and hidden for years back in Thornfield Pack, made her duck into a narrow alley instead, some part of her simply unwilling, after weeks of constant surveillance, to surrender her few stolen minutes of freedom without a fight. It was, she would realize later, the worst decision she could have made. The man who grabbed her from behind moved with a speed and silence that told her immediately he was no ordinary criminal. A gloved hand clamped over her mouth before she could scream, another arm locking around her waist, dragging her deeper into the alley's shadows. She fought, twisting and clawing, but he was far stronger than she was, and within seconds she felt cold metal press against her side, a blade she had no doubt he was fully prepared to use. "Don't struggle," a low voice hissed against her ear. "This will be quick, and it doesn't have to hurt if you cooperate." Terror flooded through her, sharp and absolute, And in that moment, Elena understood with perfect clarity that whoever had poisoned the servant boy's meal had not given up simply because their first attempt had failed. And then, impossibly, the alley exploded with movement. Cade arrived like something out of a nightmare given to her attacker instead of herself, a blur of motion and barely restrained fury that closed the distance between the alley's entrance and Elena's captor in less time than it took her to draw breath. She caught only fragments of what happened next, a snarl that did not sound entirely human, the sickening crack of the blade being wrenched away and discarded, the sudden absence of the arm around her waist, as her attacker was thrown bodily against the alley wall with enough force to crumble old brick. She stumbled forward, gasping, and strong hands caught her before she could fall, hands that shook slightly despite their strength. Elena, Cade's voice was rough, stripped of all royal composure, nothing left in it but raw fear and relief tangled together. Elena, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt. I'm all right, she managed, though her voice shook badly. I'm all right, Cade. She did not get to finish the sentence, because he pulled her against his chest so suddenly and completely that the words simply disappeared, his arms wrapping around her like he intended to physically shield her from the entire world with his own body. She could feel his heart hammering against her ear, could feel the tension radiating through every muscle in his frame, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke at all, simply standing together, in the aftermath of something that had nearly ended in tragedy. Behind them, guards were already securing her attacker, though Elena noticed with a chill that the man's face was completely unfamiliar to her, no one she had ever seen before in her life. Someone had hired a stranger. Someone had planned this carefully enough to know exactly when the palace guard's routine created a gap, exactly when she might slip away unnoticed. You cannot do this again, Cade said finally, pulling back just enough to look at her face, his golden eyes bright with an emotion too complicated to name. Elena, I understand you feel trapped. I understand the guards and the walls feel like a prison instead of protection, but I cannot lose you. Do you understand that? I have known you for barely 2 weeks, and already the thought of losing you feels like it would tear something essential out of my chest. Then let me breathe, she whispered, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to hold them back. Please, Cade. I cannot live locked inside walls for the rest of my life, even walls meant to protect me. I need you to understand that too. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as though searching for an answer that did not exist in any of the ancient texts he had spent weeks poring over. Then, slowly, he reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek, with a gentleness that seemed entirely at odds with the violence she had just witnessed him capable of. There may be another way, he said quietly, a way to protect you that does not require walls or guards or gilded cages. What do you mean? A claim bite, he said, watching her carefully for her reaction. An ancient rite, older even than the mate mark tradition itself. It does not require a mark to be present. It creates a bond directly, wolf to wolf, permanently linking 2 lives together. If I claimed you, Elena, truly claimed you, no curse could hide what exists between us any longer, and no enemy could move against you without moving against me directly. It would mean facing whatever danger exists together, rather than trying to hide you away from it entirely. Elena's breath caught. She had heard of claim bites in old stories, half-forgotten tales, meant to explain the fierce, unbreakable bonds some ancient wolves had shared before the mate mark tradition had become the accepted way of things. But those were stories, not something a modern king offered a servant girl in the aftermath of an attack, in a shadowed alley, with her attacker still bleeding on the cobblestones nearby. That's not a decision to make right now, she said slowly, though something in her chest ached at the offer, at the fierce protectiveness behind it, even as her mind rebelled against the idea of being permanently bound to anyone, while she was still shaking with fear and adrenaline. Cade, I don't even understand what happened between us yet. I can't agree to something permanent while I'm still trying to understand what's already happening. Something flickered across his face, disappointment perhaps, or simply exhaustion, but he nodded slowly, accepting her answer without argument. I understand, he said. I will not ask again until you are ready, if you are ever ready at all. But Elena, I need you to promise me something in return. What? No more slipping away without a guard. No more testing the gaps in the palace routine. Whatever this bond is between us, whatever the curse hid or revealed, I cannot protect you if you will not let me try. Elena looked at him, at the fear still lingering behind his composed expression, at the man who had just thrown a hired attacker through solid brick, without hesitation to reach her in time, and found she did not have the strength to argue any further. I promise, she said quietly, no more slipping away. He nodded, then gently guided her out of the alley, one arm still wrapped protectively around her shoulders, guards falling into formation around them as they made their way back toward the palace. Elena did not look back at the alley, did not want to see the face of the man who had nearly ended her life, over a mystery she still did not fully understand. But somewhere in the palace behind them, in a private chamber lit by candlelight, Seraphine Wren was already receiving word that her hired attacker had failed, already calculating her next move with the cold precision of someone who had spent her entire life learning exactly how to win, no matter the cost to anyone standing in her way. The unmarked servant girl had survived one attempt on her life. Seraphine intended to make certain it was not the last. The grand ballroom of Blackthorn Ridge had not seen a formal gathering in over a year, and yet within days of the attack in the alley, invitations were being sent throughout the capital for a midsummer banquet, ostensibly to celebrate the health of the kingdom, though everyone with any sense understood its true purpose. The court wanted to see the mysterious servant girl for themselves. They wanted to judge her, weigh her, decide whether she deserved the attention she had somehow captured. You do not have to attend, Cade told her the evening before, watching her turn a borrowed gown over in her hands with obvious discomfort. I can tell the court you are unwell. And let them whisper even louder that I'm hiding something? Elena shook her head, setting the gown carefully across the bed. No, if they want to look at me, let them look. I would rather face their judgment directly than spend the rest of my life cowering from it. The banquet itself was more overwhelming than Elena had anticipated. A sea of silk and jewels and carefully arranged smiles, every conversation seeming to pause slightly whenever she passed, every set of eyes following her movements with poorly disguised curiosity. She stayed close to Cade's side, grateful for his presence, even as she resented how much she had come to rely on it. It was near the center of the ballroom, beside a table laden with delicacies she did not recognize, that she first met Seraphine Wren. The noblewoman was breathtaking in the way that only years of careful cultivation could produce, every detail from her raven hair to her deep emerald gown, clearly chosen to draw every eye in the room, and when she smiled at Elena, the expression did not quite reach her sharp, calculating eyes. So you're the girl everyone is talking about, Seraphine said, her voice smooth as honey and just as cloying. Elena, is it? I must say, you're not at all what I expected. I'm not sure what you expected, Elena replied carefully, aware of the small crowd of nobles who had drifted closer, clearly hoping to witness some kind of confrontation. Someone more impressive, perhaps. It's not every day an unmarked servant catches the attention of an alpha king. Seraphine's gaze flicked deliberately to Elena's bare collarbone, where any mate mark would have been visible if one existed. How strange, to command such devotion without even the proper signs to justify it. Seraphine, Cade said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made several nearby nobles suddenly find urgent reason to look elsewhere. I mean no offense, Your Majesty, Seraphine said smoothly, though her eyes told a different story entirely. I only find it curious, don't you? An unmarked girl, suddenly the center of the entire court's attention, with no explanation offered to the rest of us who have spent years preparing ourselves properly for such an honor. She turned back to Elena, her smile sharpening. Tell me, dear, what exactly did you do to earn such extraordinary treatment? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger and humiliation tangling together, but she kept her voice steady. I didn't do anything, Lady Seraphine. I was simply in the wrong corridor at the right time. How fortunate for you. Seraphine's smile did not waver, but something cold flashed behind her eyes. Well, I do hope, for everyone's sake, that whatever this arrangement is, it resolves itself quickly. The kingdom deserves a proper queen, don't you think? One raised for the role, not stumbled into by accident. She swept away before Elena could formulate a response, leaving behind a trail of murmured conversation and speculative glances. Cade's jaw was tight as he watched her go. "I apologize," he said quietly. "Seraphine's family has been angling for a match between us for years. She is not accustomed to being overlooked." "She's dangerous," Elena said, watching the noblewoman glide across the ballroom, greeting other guests with practiced charm, as though the confrontation had never happened at all. "I don't just mean cruel, Cade. I mean genuinely dangerous. The way she looked at me." "I know." His expression had gone grim. "I will have her watched, discreetly, but closely." Elena wanted to feel reassured by that promise, but something about Seraphine's parting smile lingered in her memory long after the banquet ended, a cold certainty settling into her stomach that the noblewoman had not simply been wounded by pride. She had been calculating, already 3 steps ahead in a game only she seemed to fully understand the rules of. The archive sessions with Master Oswin continued in the following days, slow and often frustrating, but gradually, piece by piece, a picture began to emerge from the fragmented records. Elena spent hours poring over brittle pages alongside the elderly archivist, her eyes aching from strain, her patience tested by documents so damaged that entire sentences existed only as guesswork. "Here," Oswin said one afternoon, sliding a partially burned page across the table with visible excitement. "I believe I have found something significant." Elena leaned forward, squinting at the scorched edges of the document. What remained readable described, in formal court language, a decision made by the Royal Council regarding a servant woman named Rosalind, who had, according to the fragmented text, formed an inappropriate attachment to a member of the royal family during the reign of King Aldrich. "My grandmother," Elena breathed. "This is about my grandmother." "It would appear so," Oswin agreed, his magnified eyes bright with the thrill of discovery. "Though the document does not specify which member of the royal family, the relevant name has been deliberately removed, cut away, rather than simply burned. Someone did not want that detail preserved." Elena's mind raced, piecing together implications she was not certain she wanted to fully understand. "Are you saying my grandmother had some kind of relationship with someone in the royal family? With the previous king, perhaps?" "Or with someone close to him," Oswin said carefully. "A prince, a brother, a cousin. The record is frustratingly incomplete, but whatever occurred, it was significant enough for the Royal Council to intervene, and shortly after this document was filed, all further records regarding your grandmother's employment simply stop. No dismissal notice, no transfer, nothing. She simply disappears from the palace records entirely." "Around the same time the curse would have been placed on her bloodline," Elena said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in her mind with unsettling clarity. "If my grandmother was involved with someone in the royal family, and that relationship was considered inappropriate enough for the council to intervene, then perhaps the curse wasn't random misfortune at all. Perhaps it was deliberately placed to prevent her, and any daughters who came after her, from ever forming a true bond again." Oswin's expression turned grave. "That would explain why the mark suppression is specific to your maternal line, and why it has persisted so consistently across generations. A curse of that precision, targeted so specifically, would require significant magical power and deliberate intent. It was not an accident, Elena. Someone wanted your family line cursed, specifically to prevent exactly what is now happening between you and the king." The implications settled over Elena like a physical weight. If someone had cursed her grandmother's bloodline decades ago to prevent a bond between her family and the royal line, that meant whoever had cast the curse had anticipated, or feared, exactly this outcome. It meant the connection between herself and Cade was not some strange coincidence born of proximity, but the resurfacing of something that had been deliberately, painstakingly suppressed for generations. "I need to tell Cade," she said, already rising from her chair. She found him in the throne room, deep in conversation with several of his senior advisors, but he broke away the moment he saw her expression, guiding her into a private antechamber, where she quickly relayed everything Oswin had discovered. Cade's face grew increasingly troubled as she spoke, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications with the same careful weight she had felt herself. "If your grandmother was involved with someone in my family," he said slowly, and that relationship was significant enough to warrant a curse of this magnitude, then whatever bond exists between us now was already predicted, or feared, generations ago. Someone believed a Voss woman and an Ashgrove man would find each other again eventually, and they went to extraordinary lengths to prevent it. But why? Elena asked. What could possibly be so dangerous about that bond that it needed to be cursed out of existence entirely? I don't know, Kate admitted, but I intend to find out, whatever it takes. My grandfather is long dead, and any siblings or cousins from that generation as well. If someone in this palace still remembers the truth, they have kept it hidden for a very long reason. He paused, something shifting in his expression as a new thought occurred to him. Elena, if the curse was cast to prevent a bond between our families, then breaking it, or overcoming it, may carry consequences neither of us can fully predict. Whoever cast it may not be pleased to see their work undone. The warning settled uneasily in Elena's chest, and she thought again of Seraphine's cold, calculating smile at the banquet, of the hired attacker in the alley, who had known exactly when to strike. Perhaps the danger she faced was not solely rooted in court politics and jealous ambition. Perhaps something older, something tied directly to the curse itself, was also working against her, though she could not begin to guess what form that danger might ultimately take. That night, unable to sleep, Elena found herself wandering the quiet corridor outside her chambers, drawn by restlessness she could not quite name. She had not gone far before she heard voices drifting from a partially open door nearby, low and urgent, and something in their tone made her pause rather than continue past. "Cannot allow this to continue," one voice was saying, a voice Elena did not immediately recognize. "If the bond is confirmed, if he claims her fully, everything we have worked to prevent for 2 generations will unravel. Then we ensure it never reaches that point," a second voice replied, and this one Elena did recognize, cold and smooth even in a hushed whisper. "Seraphine, the girl is more resilient than I anticipated, but resilience only carries a person so far. She will not survive the season if I have anything to say about it." Elena's blood ran cold. She backed away from the door as quietly as she could manage, her heart hammering, and did not stop walking until she reached the safety of the guarded corridor near Cade's chambers, where she stood gasping quietly in the shadows, trying to process what she had just overheard. Seraphine was not simply a jealous noblewoman scheming for a royal marriage. She was working with someone else entirely, someone who understood the curse, who feared its unraveling, for reasons that went far beyond simple court ambition. And whatever their plan was, Elena now understood, with terrifying clarity, that they had no intention of stopping until she was permanently removed from Cade's life, whatever the cost. She did not sleep at all that night, and when dawn finally broke over the palace gardens, she made her way immediately to Cade's study, prepared to tell him everything, unaware that the confrontation which would nearly cost her life was already being set into motion just beyond the palace walls. Cade listened to Elena's account of the overheard conversation, with an expression that grew darker with every word, his hands clenched so tightly on the edge of his desk that his knuckles had gone pale. "You're certain it was Seraphine's voice," he said, though it was less a question than a confirmation he already dreaded hearing. "Certain," Elena said, "and whoever she was speaking with mentioned 2 generations, Cade. They know about the curse. They know exactly what it was meant to prevent, and they seem just as determined to keep preventing it now as whoever cast it was decades ago. Then Seraphine's family may be connected to whoever placed the curse originally." Cade rose from his desk, pacing the length of his study with restless, coiled energy. "Her grandmother served in this palace during my grandfather's reign as well, in a minor advisory capacity. I had not thought to connect the 2 families before, but if there is a history there, it would explain a great deal." "What do we do?" "We move carefully," Cade said, though frustration was evident in his voice. "I cannot simply arrest a noblewoman of Seraphine's standing on the strength of an overheard conversation, not without solid proof that would hold against her family's inevitable challenge. But I can increase your protection further, and I can have my most trusted people investigate her family's history discreetly." "More guards," Elena said flatly. "More walls." "Cade, that isn't working. Someone already got close enough to hire an attacker for that alley. If Seraphine is willing to go that far once, she will find another way." "Then what would you have me do?" His voice cracked slightly with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show, frustration tangled with fear he had clearly been suppressing since the moment she first told him what she'd overheard. "I cannot lose you, Elena. I have tried every approach I can think of, and none of it feels like enough." Elena crossed the room and took his hands in hers, an instinctive gesture that surprised them both with its familiarity, as though some part of her had already grown accustomed to the closeness they had built over these past weeks. "I know," she said softly. "I know you're trying, but we cannot outguard a threat like this. We have to end it directly." "How?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But hiding hasn't worked, and it isn't going to start working now. Whatever Seraphine is planning, we need to draw it out into the open, where you can act against her with actual proof instead of suspicion." Cade studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his golden eyes. "You would put yourself at risk deliberately to draw her out?" "I already am at risk," Elena said. "The only difference is whether we control when and where that risk becomes visible, or whether we simply wait for her to choose the moment herself." He did not like the plan. That much was obvious in the tightness of his jaw and the reluctance in his eyes, but eventually, after much discussion and careful planning with his most trusted advisors, they settled on an approach. Elena would attend the upcoming autumn hunt, a traditional court event that brought together nobles from across the kingdom, an event Seraphine's family had confirmed attendance for weeks earlier. Guards would be present, but positioned to appear less obvious than the constant shadow Elena had grown used to, creating what would seem, to anyone watching, like an opportunity. The forest surrounding the hunting grounds stretched for miles, ancient trees casting deep shadows even at midday, and Elena found herself grateful for the crisp autumn air after weeks spent largely confined within palace walls. She rode near the back of the hunting party, flanked at a careful distance by 2 guards disguised as ordinary huntsmen, her senses alert for anything that might signal danger. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened beyond the ordinary business of the hunt, horns sounding in the distance, hounds baying as they tracked scent through the underbrush, nobles laughing and calling to one another as they competed for the day's most impressive kill. Elena began to wonder whether their plan had been unnecessary after all, whether Seraphine's threats had been nothing more than idle cruelty. Then, as the hunting party pressed deeper into a particularly dense section of forest, Elena's horse suddenly reared without warning, throwing her hard against the ground before bolting into the trees. She hit the earth with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs, pain flaring through her shoulder and hip, and by the time she managed to push herself upright, gasping, she realized with growing dread that the sounds of the hunting party had faded into an unsettling distance. She was alone. "Hello?" she called, her voice sounding small and swallowed by the vast, silent forest around her. "Is anyone there?" No response came, except the rustle of leaves overhead and the distant, mocking call of a bird. Atsina forced herself to breathe steadily, to think rather than panic, and began moving in the direction she believed the hunting party had traveled, favoring her uninjured leg as she walked. She had gone perhaps 100 paces when she heard it, the snap of a branch behind her, too deliberate to be an animal, too controlled to be an accident. She spun around, heart hammering, and found herself facing not one figure, but 3, emerging from the trees with the unhurried confidence of people who believed they had already won. "Well," said a voice she recognized immediately, and Seraphine stepped forward from behind her hired men, her elegant riding attire seeming almost absurdly out of place among the grim purpose etched into her expression. "This is going more smoothly than I anticipated. I do hope your horse wasn't too traumatized by the noise device we attached to its saddle." "Seraphine." Elena backed away slowly, calculating distances, escape routes, anything that might buy her time. "Whatever you think this accomplishes, it won't work. Cade will know exactly who is responsible." "Will he?" Seraphine's smile was cold and utterly without remorse. "By the time anyone finds your body, dear, it will look exactly like a tragic hunting accident. A frightened horse, a fall, perhaps an unfortunate encounter with wild animals, to explain any injuries that don't quite match a simple fall. Nobody will think to question it, because nobody wants to believe their beloved king's mysterious new interest was murdered on his own hunting grounds." "Why?" Elena demanded, still backing away. still searching desperately for any advantage. What did my family ever do to deserve this? What did I do, beyond simply existing? Something flickered across Seraphine's composed features, an emotion Elena could not immediately identify. You truly don't know, do you? How wonderfully ignorant. She took a step closer, her hired men flanking her with predatory patience. Your grandmother stole something that was never hers to take, Elena. A bond that belonged to someone else entirely. My grandmother spent her entire life watching the man she loved pine after a servant girl who had no right to claim his attention, and when Rosalind Voss finally disappeared, cursed and banished by my own family's hand, it should have ended there. The debt should have been settled. You're talking about the curse, Elena said slowly, pieces finally clicking into place with sickening clarity. Your family placed it, not the royal family, yours. My grandmother had the power to see it done, and the motivation to see it done thoroughly, Seraphine said, no trace of shame in her voice. And now here you are, decades later, somehow finding your way right back into an Ashgrove's heart, despite everything we sacrificed to prevent exactly this outcome. I will not allow history to repeat itself. I will not watch another Wren woman lose everything she deserves to another Voss girl who simply happened to be in the right place at the wrong time. Elena's mind raced, understanding now the full, devastating shape of the conspiracy she had stumbled into. But understanding did not slow the men now advancing toward her with clear, violent intent. She turned to run, adrenaline surging through her injured body, but one of the hired men was faster, closing the distance and seizing her arm with brutal force before she had gone more than a few steps. She fought, twisting and kicking with everything she had, but he was far stronger, dragging her back toward Seraphine with terrifying ease. She caught a glimpse of a blade being drawn, felt genuine terror flood through her chest for the first time since the alley weeks earlier, and opened her mouth to scream. The scream never came. Instead, the forest around them erupted into chaos as a massive, snarling shape crashed through the underbrush, with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of nature entirely, and Elena's captor was torn away from her so violently that she stumbled to her knees, gasping, watching in stunned horror and relief, as Cade, fully shifted into his wolf form for the first time she had ever witnessed, tore through Seraphine's hired men with a fury that left no doubt about what would have happened had he arrived even moments later. Seraphine tried to flee, but two of Cade's guards emerged from the trees behind her, blocking her escape, their expressions leaving no room for negotiation. Within minutes, the confrontation was over. Seraphine's men subdued or fled, Seraphine herself restrained, and shouting furious, unrepentant accusations that echoed through the forest until the guards finally silenced her. Cade shifted back, breathing hard, and crossed the distance to Elena in 3 long strides, dropping to his knees beside her, his hands running over her arms and shoulders with frantic, desperate care. Elena, look at me. Are you hurt? Tell me where you're hurt. I'm all right, she managed, though her voice shook badly, and tears finally spilled over, despite her best efforts to hold them back. Cade, she confessed everything. Her family cast the curse. Her grandmother was in love with someone in your family, and my grandmother somehow stood in the way, and they've spent decades making sure no Voss woman could ever bond again. Cade's jaw tightened, fury and relief warring visibly across his features. It's over now, he said, pulling her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injuries but unwilling, it seemed, to let even a small distance remain between them. Seraphine will answer for everything she's done. You are safe now, Elena. I swear it. But even as he held her there in the quiet aftermath of the forest, the danger finally, truly passed. Elena found herself thinking of something else entirely, something that had crystallized in her mind during those terrifying moments when she believed her life was about to end. She had run out of patience for uncertainty. She had run out of willingness to hide from what she felt, simply because it defied old laws and older curses. Cade, she said quietly, pulling back just enough to look into his eyes. Ask me again. Ask you what? The claim bite, she said, her heart pounding for entirely different reasons now. Ask me again, because I think I already know my answer. Cade went very still, kneeling there in the fading autumn light, with Elena's blood-flecked sleeve still gripped gently in his hands, and for a long moment He simply looked at her, as though he could not quite believe what she had said. "Elena," he said carefully, "you have just survived an attempt on your life. You are frightened, and hurt, and running on nothing but adrenaline. I will not take a promise made in a moment like this one, and treat it as a lifetime decision. That's exactly why I need you to hear me now," she said, pushing herself more upright despite the ache in her shoulder, refusing to let the moment slip away, simply because he wanted to protect her from her own certainty. "Cade, I have spent my entire life being told I was unwanted. Unmarked, a waste of resources, a burden to be shipped away and forgotten. I believed it. For years I believed every word of it, until the moment you looked at me in that corridor and refused to look away." She reached for his hand, steadying herself, steadying him. "I have spent weeks doubting what's between us, telling myself it was too fast, too strange, too impossible to be real. But sitting here, watching you tear through those men without a second of hesitation, hearing Seraphine confess that an entire family conspired for decades to make sure this exact moment never happened, I understand something I didn't before. This isn't a mistake, Cade. This isn't a curse's cruel trick or a coincidence of timing. This is real, and it has been real since the first moment you asked if I was mated." Cade's throat worked as he swallowed, emotion he rarely allowed himself to show breaking visibly across his composed features. "I felt it the instant I saw you," he admitted quietly. "Before I ever spoke a word to you, before I knew your name, something in my chest simply recognized you, as though some part of me had been waiting my entire life for exactly that moment. I told myself it was impossible too. An unmarked servant girl, a connection with no precedent in any text I could find. But impossible or not, it has not faded in the slightest, not for a single day since." "Then don't wait any longer," Elena said softly. "Don't let a curse decide what we're allowed to have. Claim me, Cade, not because I'm frightened, and not because of what almost happened today, but because I choose you. I have chosen you for weeks now. I simply needed the courage to say it aloud." For a moment, Cade said nothing at all, simply searching her face, as though memorizing every detail of it, every freckle and every faint scar, every flicker of emotion in her eyes. Then, slowly, he reached up and cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing gently across her cheekbones. "There will be no going back from this," he warned, though his voice had softened into something achingly tender. "A claim bite cannot be undone, Elena. Whatever this bond becomes, we will carry it together for the rest of our lives." "I know," she whispered. "I want that. I want you." He kissed her then, gently at first, as though still afraid this moment might shatter if he moved too quickly, and Elena felt something inside her chest crack open. Years of loneliness and rejection finally giving way to something warm and certain and entirely new. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting gently against hers, his breathing unsteady, she could feel him trembling slightly, the composed king momentarily gone entirely. "Are you certain?" he asked one final time. "More certain than I have ever been about anything," she said. He guided her gently to tilt her head, exposing the curve of her neck and shoulder, and Elena felt a flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation as she watched his eyes shift, gold deepening into something more primal, more ancient than the calm, controlled king she had come to know over these past weeks. When his mouth finally pressed against her skin, the bite that followed was quick and precise, a sharp burst of pain that faded almost instantly into something else entirely, a warmth that spread outward from the point of contact, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long winter. She gasped, her hands clutching at his shoulders, and felt something shift deep within her, some hidden barrier finally breaking after decades of suppression, generations of stolen bonds finally released all at once. A golden light bloomed across her collarbone, faint at first, then brightening steadily until it settled into a clear, unmistakable mark, curved and delicate, exactly like the one she had spent her entire life watching bloom on every other girl in her village except herself. "Cade," she breathed, staring down at her own skin in stunned disbelief. "Cade, look." He was already looking, his golden eyes wide with wonder as he traced the new mark with gentle fingers, his own composure completely dissolved into something raw and unguarded. "The curse," he said softly. "Elena, the curse is broken. Your mark, it's real. It's finally here. Tears spilled down her cheeks, though this time they carried nothing but overwhelming relief and joy. Decades of her family's stolen legacy finally restored in a single, irreversible moment. She looked up at him, at this man who had refused to blink the first time their eyes met, who had thrown himself between her and every danger since without a moment's hesitation, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, that she truly, completely, belonged somewhere. "We need to get you back to the palace," Cade said finally, though he did not let go of her, gathering her carefully into his arms instead, and rising to his feet with her held securely against his chest. "Your injuries need proper attention, and Seraphine's confession needs to be recorded formally before her family's lawyers can attempt to bury it in technicalities." "What will happen to her?" Elena asked, as he began carrying her back through the forest, guards falling into protective formation around them. "Exile, at the very least," Cade said grimly. "Attempted murder against the crown's chosen mate carries severe consequences under our laws, and I intend to see every one of them applied fully. Her family's estates will be seized, their standing at court permanently revoked. Whatever debt they believed they were owed by your grandmother's family, Elena, ends today, in full." Elena rested her head against his shoulder, exhaustion finally catching up with the adrenaline that had carried her through the past hour, and allowed herself, for the first time in weeks, to simply feel safe rather than merely hoping to be. The journey back to the palace passed in a blur of relief and exhaustion, healers tending to her shoulder, and the various scrapes and bruises she had accumulated, while elsewhere in the palace, Seraphine and her remaining co-conspirators were formally questioned, and their confessions recorded before witnesses whose testimony could not later be disputed. By the time evening fell, the full scope of the conspiracy had been laid bare, decades of resentment and stolen power revealed in exhausting, ugly detail. Cade did not leave Elena's side throughout any of it, sitting beside her bed, in the healer's quarters, long after the physicians had finished their work, his hand wrapped around hers as though he could not bear to release it even for a moment. When Master Oswin finally arrived with the last of the archive records, breathless with excitement despite the late hour, he confirmed what they had already suspected. Seraphine's grandmother, a woman named Isolde Wren, had indeed served as an advisor during King Aldric's reign, and had indeed harbored a deep, unrequited devotion toward a young prince of the Ashgrove line, a devotion the prince had never returned, choosing instead to fall in love with a servant woman named Rosalind Voss. When the prince died young, before he could formally claim Rosalind, Oswin explained, adjusting his spectacles as he read from the recovered records, Isolde Wren used her considerable influence and magical ability to ensure that no daughter of the Voss line would ever again threaten to claim what she believed her own family deserved. It was, by every measure, an act of profound bitterness, one she passed down to her own children, and eventually to Seraphine herself. All of this, Elena said softly, over a love that never even had the chance to fully bloom in the first place. Bitterness rarely requires much justification to grow, Oswin said sagely. Only time, and a willingness to nurture it. Cade squeezed Elena's hand gently. "It ends with us," he said quietly. "Whatever pain existed between our families, whatever was stolen from your grandmother and mine, it ends here, tonight. You are safe, Elena. You are marked, and claimed, and no curse or conspiracy will ever again threaten to take that away." Elena looked down at the golden mark still glowing faintly on her collarbone, then up at the man who had claimed her not out of obligation or ancient law, but out of genuine, hard-won choice, and felt something settle deep within her chest that she had never expected to feel in her entire life. Peace, belonging, home. But even as relief washed over her, a small, cautious part of her mind understood that the true test of everything they had built together was still ahead. Seraphine's exile would satisfy the law, but it would not necessarily satisfy every noble family who had hoped for a different outcome, nor would it address the deeper question of whether the kingdom's court would ever truly accept an unmarked servant girl, curse broken or not, as the rightful mate of their king. That test, Elena understood, was only just beginning. 3 weeks after the forest confrontation, Elena stood before a full gathering of the royal court for the formal announcement of her claiming, and though her shoulder had healed, and the golden mark on her collarbone had settled into a permanent, unmistakable brightness. She felt no less nervous walking into that grand hall than she had the very first time she had entered it as a lowly servant carrying trays. The whispers had not entirely stopped, though their tone had shifted considerably since Seraphine's exile had become public knowledge. Where once the court had murmured about bewitchment and scheming, they now spoke, cautiously, of fate and old wrongs finally righted. Not everyone believed it, of course. Elena caught more than a few skeptical glances from noble families who had hoped their own daughters might one day stand where she now stood. But Cade remained close beside her throughout the ceremony, his presence a steady anchor against the weight of so many watching eyes. "You may not win them all over," he murmured to her, as they walked the length of the hall together, "but you have already won the ones who matter most." "And which ones are those?" she whispered back. "The people who actually know you," he said. "Everyone else simply needs time." Time, however, proved to be in short supply. Barely a month after the formal announcement, word arrived from the northern border that a rival pack, the Grimwalds of the Frozen Ridges, had begun making aggressive incursions into Blackthorn Ridge territory, testing the strength of a kingdom whose Alpha King had, in their eyes, weakened his own standing by claiming an unmarked commoner rather than securing a strategic alliance through a noble or royal match. "They see this as an opportunity," Cade explained grimly, spreading a map across his war table while his senior advisors gathered around him, their expressions tense. "The Grimwalds have coveted our northern territories for generations. My father held them back through strength and strategic marriages that secured allied support. They believe, now, that I have made myself vulnerable by choosing love over politics." Elena stood at the edge of the war table, feeling distinctly out of place among generals and advisors discussing troop movements and border defenses, yet unwilling to simply retreat to her chambers while the kingdom she now called home faced a genuine threat. "What do they want, specifically? Territory, resources, and ultimately, submission," said General Aldous, a grizzled older wolf who had served under Cade's father before him. "The Grimwald Alpha, a brutal wolf named Thane Grimwald, has never hidden his ambition to expand his pack's holdings southward. He has simply lacked sufficient justification or sufficient confidence in our weakness to act on it directly until now. And my claiming provided that confidence," Elena said quietly, guilt threading through her voice despite everyone's careful reassurances otherwise. "You provided nothing but happiness to your king," Cade said firmly, meeting her eyes across the table with unwavering conviction. "If Thane Grimwald wishes to interpret love as weakness, he will find himself sorely mistaken about the strength that bond actually provides." Over the following weeks, the northern border tensions escalated steadily, skirmishes reported with increasing frequency, villages near the frontier requesting additional protection as Grimwald scouts grew bolder in their incursions. Elena watched Cade grow increasingly consumed by the demands of defending his kingdom, and found herself determined to be more than simply a source of worry and distraction during a time when he needed clarity and strength above all else. She began attending council meetings whenever permitted, listening carefully, learning the intricacies of border politics and pack alliances that had never been part of her education as a servant girl from the Eastern Hills. She sought out General Aldous privately, asking questions about troop strength and defensive strategy, until the old general, initially skeptical of her presence, began to respect the sharpness of her questions and the genuine care behind them. "You have a mind for this," Aldous admitted to her one evening, after a particularly detailed conversation about supply lines to the northern garrisons. "Most nobles born to this life never bother learning the details as thoroughly as you have in a matter of weeks." "I have spent my entire life being told I had nothing valuable to offer," Elena said simply. "I don't intend to prove that belief correct now, when it matters more than it ever has before." It was during one of these council sessions that word arrived of a direct challenge from Thane Grimwald himself, delivered by a scarred messenger who had traveled south under a flag of parley, demanding an audience with the king. "He wishes to negotiate terms," the messenger reported, standing rigid before the assembled council, "but he has made clear that any terms will require significant concessions of northern territory, along with formal acknowledgement of Grimwald's superiority over Blackthorn Ridge in matters of border governance." Absurd, General Aldous snapped. We have held that border for 3 generations. We will not surrender it simply because a hungry wolf believes our king distracted by love. There is another option, the messenger said carefully, glancing toward Cade with obvious reluctance. Alpha Grimwold has proposed a formal challenge, a contest of strength, conducted under the old traditions, to settle the border dispute without further bloodshed among our packs. Winner takes the disputed territory, and the loser withdraws all claims permanently. The council erupted into heated debate immediately, voices rising over one another as advisors weighed the risks and merits of accepting such a challenge. Cade remained silent throughout most of it, his expression unreadable, until finally he raised a hand for quiet. I will consider the proposal, he said. But I will not decide hastily, and I will not decide alone. That evening, in the privacy of their shared chambers, Elena found him standing at the window, staring out toward the northern horizon, with an intensity that told her his mind had not truly left the war table at all. You're considering it, she said, joining him at the window. The challenge. I am, he admitted. Thane Grimwold is a formidable opponent, but I have trained for combat my entire life, in ways he cannot know or anticipate. A direct challenge would spare countless lives that a full border conflict would otherwise cost, soldiers and villagers alike who have no part in this dispute beyond simply living in its path. And if you lose? Then Blackthorn Ridge loses its northern territories, and quite possibly its king, Cade said quietly, honestly, refusing to soften the reality of what he faced. It is not a risk I take lightly, Elena, but it is one I believe worth taking, if it spares my people the alternative. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, fear for him settling cold and heavy in her stomach, though she understood, even as the fear gripped her, that she could not ask him to abandon his duty to his kingdom, simply to ease her own worry. Then I want to be there, she said finally. When you face him, I refuse to wait in the palace, wondering, while you risk your life on some frozen ridge in the north. Elena, that is far too dangerous. So was standing in a corridor, while a guard held a knife to my throat, she interrupted gently. So was walking into a forest, where Seraphine's men waited with drawn blades. I have never once been safe, simply by staying behind walls, Cade. I would rather stand beside you, and face whatever comes together, than hide here, helpless, while you determine the fate of both our kingdom and our future alone. He studied her for a long moment, torn between the instinct to protect her at all costs, and a growing understanding, built over these past months, that Elena Voss had never once been the kind of woman content to remain passively protected, while others determined her fate around her. All right, he said finally, quietly. You will come. But you will remain under heavy guard throughout, and you will trust me to handle Thane Grimwold myself, whatever happens. I trust you, Elena said, and meant it completely, in a way she had never expected to trust anyone, after years of being told she was unworthy of trust or care from anyone at all. I trust you with everything I have left. 3 days later, as their party departed the capital and began the long, cold journey north toward the frozen border where Blackthorn Ridge's future, and quite possibly Cade's very life, would soon be decided, Elena found herself thinking not of fear, but of how far she had traveled from the terrified servant girl who had once stood frozen in a corridor with a blade against her throat. She had found love where she had once believed only loneliness awaited her. She had found purpose where she had once believed only servitude defined her worth. And now, whatever awaited them on that frozen northern ridge, she intended to face it, not as someone who needed saving, but as someone prepared to stand and fight for everything she had finally been allowed to claim as her own. The northern ridge where the challenge was to take place stretched wide and white beneath a pale winter sky, wind cutting sharp across the exposed rock, and Elena pulled her heavy fur cloak tighter as she stood among Cade's small honor guard, watching the Grimwold party approach from the opposite ridge, like a dark stain spreading across the snow. Thane Grimwold was every bit as imposing as the reports had suggested, a massive wolf even in his human form, scarred across one side of his face from some old battle, his eyes carrying none of the golden warmth that made Cade's gaze feel like sunlight even in his most intense moments. Grimwold's eyes were flat, calculating, the eyes of a predator who had never once doubted his own eventual victory in anything he set out to claim. "Ashgrove," Grimwald called across the space between the two parties, his voice carrying easily on the sharp wind. "I confess, I did not expect you to actually accept my challenge. I assumed love had made you soft." "Then you assumed incorrectly," Cade replied evenly, stepping forward from his own party, his expression calm despite the obvious tension coiled beneath his composed exterior. "Shall we begin? Or do you intend to waste the daylight on further insults?" Grimwald's laugh was cold and humorless. "Straight to business, then. Very well." He gestured to the open expanse of snow between the two ridges, marked at its edges by ceremonial stakes driven into the frozen ground. "The terms remain as stated. We fight in wolf form, no weapons beyond what nature gave us, until one of us yields or can no longer continue. The victor claims the disputed territory, permanently, and the loser withdraws all further claims for a generation." "Agreed," Cade said. Elena's heart hammered as she watched Cade remove his heavy cloak and hand it to a nearby guard, watched the ripple of transformation move through his body as he shifted into his wolf form, larger and more powerful than any wolf she had ever seen, his fur a deep, striking black that seemed to absorb the pale winter light around him. Across the field, Thane Grimwald shifted as well, his own form massive and scarred, gray fur bristling with barely contained aggression. The two wolves circled each other slowly at first, testing, each measuring the other's speed and strength, before committing to any decisive movement. Elena gripped the edge of her cloak so tightly her knuckles ached, every instinct screaming at her to look away, unable to tear her eyes from the battle unfolding before her. Grimwald struck first, a sudden brutal lunge that Cade barely avoided, twisting aside at the last possible moment, before countering with a snap of powerful jaws that caught Grimwald's shoulder, drawing dark blood against the white snow. The larger wolf snarled, whirling to retaliate, and the fight quickly devolved into a blur of motion, too fast for Elena to fully track, snarls and impacts echoing across the frozen ridge, blood staining the pristine snow beneath their paws. It went on for what felt like an eternity, though Elena knew later it had likely been only minutes, each wolf landing blows and absorbing them in turn, neither willing to yield despite injuries that would have felled a lesser fighter entirely. Elena watched, heart in her throat, as Grimwald managed to pin Cade beneath his greater bulk at one point, jaws snapping dangerously close to his throat, and she very nearly cried out before Cade twisted free with a burst of strength that seemed to draw from somewhere beyond simple physical power, throwing the larger wolf off balance long enough to gain the advantage. The end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its suddenness. Cade caught Grimwald's foreleg in a grip that would not release, no matter how the larger wolf thrashed and snarled, until finally, with a sound of genuine pain and reluctant acknowledgement, Grimwald went still, his posture shifting into the universal signal of submission that no wolf, however proud, could fake or fabricate. Cade released him immediately, stepping back, and after a long moment both wolves shifted back into their human forms, breathing hard, bleeding from numerous wounds, but standing. "The territory remains Blackthorn Ridges," Cade said, his voice rough but steady, "and the Grimwald pack withdraws all claims for the span of one full generation, as agreed." Thane Grimwald, kneeling in the bloodied snow, looked up at Cade with an expression that held, for the first time since his arrival, something almost like respect. "You fight better than I anticipated for a king so distracted by love," he admitted grudgingly. "Perhaps," Cade said, "it is precisely because of that love that I fought as well as I did." He glanced back across the field toward where Elena stood, and something in his expression, even bloodied and exhausted, softened considerably. "There is nothing weak about having something worth protecting, Grimwald. I would suggest you remember that, the next time you consider testing a kingdom's strength based on assumptions about its king's heart." Elena rushed forward the moment the formalities allowed it, ignoring the guards' half-hearted attempts to maintain proper protocol, and threw her arms around Cade despite the blood and injuries, careless of anything except the overwhelming relief of seeing him alive and victorious. "You're hurt," she said, pulling back just enough to survey the deep gashes along his side and shoulder, worry immediately overtaking relief. "I'll heal," he said, though he winced slightly as she pressed careful fingers near one of the deeper wounds. Wolves recover quickly from injuries sustained in fair combat. It looks far worse than it actually is. That is not remotely reassuring, Elena said, though a laugh escaped her despite herself. Relief and residual fear tangling together into something that felt suspiciously close to joy. Let's get you back to camp, before you decide to prove your recovery abilities by fainting in front of the entire honor guard. The journey back to the capital, once Cade's wounds had been properly tended, and the northern border formally secured through Grimwold's withdrawal, felt entirely different from the tense, uncertain trip north weeks earlier. Word of Cade's victory had traveled ahead of them, and by the time their party approached the palace gates, crowds had gathered along the roadside, cheering not simply for their king's successful defense of the kingdom, but, as Elena quickly realized with some surprise, cheering for her as well. "They're calling your name," Cade murmured to her, as their carriage moved slowly through the celebrating crowds, genuine warmth in his voice despite his lingering exhaustion. "I don't understand why," Elena admitted. "I didn't fight anyone. I simply stood there and worried the entire time." "You stood beside your king through a border war, after surviving an assassination attempt, after enduring months of court scrutiny and scheming nobles who wished you gone," Cade said gently. "The people of this kingdom understand strength when they see it, Elena, even when it does not come in the form of teeth and claws." The formal coronation, when it finally took place several weeks later, unfolded in the same grand hall where Elena had once stood frozen and terrified, uncertain of her place, in a world that had never seemed to want her. Now she stood at its center, dressed not in a servant's plain garments, but in robes of deep blue and gold, the mark on her collarbone displayed openly and proudly for the entire court to witness, as Cade placed a delicate silver circlet upon her head, with hands that trembled slightly, whether from lingering injury or simple emotion. Elena could not entirely tell. "Elena Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent, watching hall, "chosen mate, survivor, and now Queen of Blackthorn Ridge. Not because ancient law demanded it, and not because a mark alone required it, but because you have proven, time and again, through every trial this kingdom and its enemies have thrown against you, that you belong exactly where you now stand." Applause thundered through the hall, genuine and unrestrained, and Elena felt tears she did not bother trying to hide, as she looked out over the gathered court, remembering the whispers and suspicious glances that had once followed her every movement through these same halls. So much had changed since that first terrifying night in the corridor, when a king who refused to blink had asked a simple, impossible question that had upended her entire understanding of who she was allowed to become. Later that evening, standing together on a private balcony overlooking the palace gardens below, Elena leaned into Cade's side, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, both of them finally able to simply exist in a quiet moment together, without the weight of danger or scheming enemies pressing down around them. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "That night in the corridor, asking if I was mated, when you had no way of knowing what it might cost you." "Never," Cade said immediately, without a moment's hesitation. "Elena, the moment I saw you, something in me simply knew, with a certainty I have never questioned since, no matter how impossible it seemed at the time. I did not blink that night, because some part of me understood that if I looked away, even for a single second, I might lose the only thing I had ever truly wanted, before I even had the chance to claim it. And now?" she asked, tilting her head up to look at him, at this man who had transformed her entire life through nothing more than a refusal to look away. "Now," he said, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, "I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never once doubt that you belong exactly here, beside me, exactly as you are." Below them, the palace gardens stretched quiet and peaceful beneath the rising moon, the kingdom of Blackthorn Ridge settling into a hard-won peace that neither Elena nor Cade took for granted, not after everything they had survived together to reach this moment. The curse that had haunted her family for generations lay broken and forgotten. The enemies who had sought to keep them apart had been defeated, exiled, or humbled into respectful retreat. And Elena Voss, once the unmarked, unwanted girl sent away by her own family, stood now as queen beside a king who had never once, since that very first night, allowed himself to look away from her. Whatever challenges the future might still hold, she understood now, with a certainty as unshakable as the mark glowing softly against her skin, that she would face them exactly as she had faced everything else since that night in the corridor. Not alone, and not afraid, but standing firmly beside the one person who had looked at her, truly looked at her, and refused, from that very first moment, to ever let her go.